Education. It's something many people take for granted. We expect that school administrators will teach our children in the best way possible. However, when it comes to the education of deaf students in America, there has been a silent debate that has been going on for nearly 2 centuries. At the heart of this debate were 2 men, Edward Minor Gallaudet and Alexander Graham Bell. Why is what happened 200 years ago of any concern to deaf children getting their education today? Do age-old philosophies still influence decisions being made on behalf of deaf students? As educators who might have deaf students in our classroom, how does this knowledge of the history of the deaf education affect the way we teach? Here these are 2 men, Gallaudet and Bell, who could not come together to see eye to eye on how to educate deaf people. Ironically, both men had deaf in their family. Bell's mother was hard of hearing and at the time used this trumpet amplification for her hearing. And Gallaudet's mother was also deaf. However, both of them used 2 different means of communication, and it probably had strong influence of how they then felt deaf children should be taught. Bell thought it should be all oral, and they should be learning how to speak, no sign language whatsoever. And then here you have Gallaudet, who was a lifelong signer, and he wanted sign language and different modalities taught in the school, that if they had some residual hearing, they should use some speech, some lip reading, but do not take away their sign language. So those 2 men felt very, very differently about that.
Speech is very helpful. The ability to speak is very valuable, but there should not be a deprivation of sign language. Deaf and hard of hearing people are visual learners, and sign language is extremely valuable to them. For a deaf or hard of hearing person to have access to both the ability to speak and the use of sign language will help them in their everyday communication, and it will benefit them in many other ways. But the issue should be addressed on an individual or case-by-case basis.
Really, it doesn't matter whether someone learns orally or with sign language, whether they are deaf, deaf-blind. Regardless of their disability, I do believe the best place for them to be educated is in a residential school. Being there, it provides so many opportunities for learning, and there are deaf role models and adults that they can look up to and learn from. That socialization is vital. They get to learn from each other, and it creates a family-like atmosphere for them.
Deaf peers are extremely important in the educational setting. It may be there is a public school with a large number of mainstream students, but where the deaf population is limited to only a few isolated students, the success rate isn't as great. Where there's more opportunity for socialization, learning from each other provides an ideal educational setting. When they have other deaf peers to work with, it's so important. It strengthens their development and is really what they need for success.
So while these 2 men in the forefront of making decisions for deaf children in schools across America, it would be hard to detach the philosophies and influences they were surrounded with in their decisions and what they promoted. What caused such a rift between these 2 men and what they believed would be best for deaf students? Could some of the same ideologies influence decision makers today on behalf of deaf children and their education? There is no doubt today the education system is a very hearing-centered and oriented institution. Many claim that the deaf are made to conform to hearing standards and ways that learning for hearing would be more successful, rather than thinking of the accommodations and accessibilities that would make learning so much easier and enjoyable for deaf. It is also the reason why many parents who have babies born with severe hearing loss or deafness are immediately encouraged to implant their child with a cochlear implant to make them hearing again, in an immediate response to have them conform to a hearing world. Many are unfamiliar not only with the success of these implants, but also the true feelings of how the deaf feel after receiving them. Was there something deeper behind Alexander Graham Bell's position to forbid the native language of signing among deaf and their education? It's interesting, both of these men did want what they thought at the time was best for deaf children in the school system. In that league of eugenics who were very against immigration at the time of people coming into the country, he felt and has written in many of his papers that deaf people should not be marrying one another because it would cause more deaf people to abound. And it's just very interesting that the ignorance that they had at that time, not knowing that over 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents, that was the thinking and the mentality that was going on. He did not want to get involved with legislation to forbid them to marry because he felt that would be too unpractical. So he said, let's take down their social clubs, let's get them and separate them, break them apart, and this way they won't be getting together to marry, whereas in the deaf culture that is the number one tie that keeps them together, which is their language and their culture and what they all have in common. So that socialization was imperative for deaf people, especially at that time.
I was born with 80 decibel hearing loss, so I was taught how to speak. Had it been any higher than that, it would have been difficult for me. 80 was okay, 90 would have been a challenge, 100 or greater would have been difficult to learn how to speak. So definitely it depends on what kind of hearing loss you have.
I have noticed among my students, whether they're from mainstream settings or with cochlear implants, the signing proficiency is just not there.
When it comes to the education of deaf children, socialization is a key factor that is often missed. While the individual circumstances surrounding each deaf student vary, the social aspect cannot be ignored. Alexander Graham Bell did not succeed in eliminating sign language from among the deaf. It still remains an integral part of their lives and part of their education.